everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that everyone is healthy and well as we adjust to the new normal. First of all, I would like to thank the Indiana Music Teachers Association for organizing this wonderful opportunity for educators and researchers to give our presentations virtually and connect online. So in this presentation, we are going to talk all about the first day of classes. If you've ever dreaded teaching a first day of class like me, I promise that I can help you. After this presentation, you will feel more at ease and have an idea of where to start your journey to becoming more comfortable with teaching the first day of classes. We are going to turn all those yikes into yays. So before I begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Nicha Stapanukul, and I am currently a doctoral student at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. And although my major is piano performance and has been for the past 2 degrees, I am very much interested and involved in other aspects of the music field. I've been an associate instructor of secondary piano here at the university since 2017, and I am also on the faculty at the IU Young Pianist program. In addition to teaching, I am also the vice president of the MTNA at IU Collegiate Chapter and also the executive assistant of the IU Young Pianist program. Okay, so that's enough about me. So now let's talk about the first day of classes. Why are the first day of classes so important? That's because it's an opportunity that only comes around once a semester. I used to get so nervous and so anxious when I even think about first day of a new semester, especially in a big classroom. And that's because this is where your students' first impressions and judgments of you and your classes will begin. Their attitude towards the class, the efforts they put into the class, and the relationship you have with them will stem from that very first impression. And the first day of class can also give you a very clear vision of how to navigate and adjust the course path at a very early stage. It's also a very crucial time to create a learning community for your students that will make your students want to come to class instead of feeling like they have to. And there is so much to talk about regarding the first day of classes, so let's dive in. So in today's session, we will be looking at the 4 key principles as outlined in James Lang's article from the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled How to Teach a Good First Day of Class, and how it applies directly to teaching music. I will be using examples specifically geared towards teaching piano, as I am a pianist. Examples will vary from group piano to private lessons and virtual settings drawn from my personal experiences. However, all the components that I will be talking about today are essentially applicable to teaching any instrument in the given setting. We will also look at the active learning component and why it is important to incorporate it right at the very first day of class. So, first off, you might be wondering why I chose this specific article. Well, here's a quick little backstory. I started teaching seriously when I was 20, and I sort of learned on the job over the years, as we all do. And I feel like I formulated a system that worked for me to a point where I finally felt comfortable teaching the first day of classes. I learned what worked in different teaching settings and learned what to change over the course of several years of trial and error. But I never really consciously thought about what it was that I was doing that made me feel more comfortable. I just learned over time. And then I encountered this article given to me in a class, and it outlined a system that I formulated for myself into these super simple 4 key principles that I thought was really worth sharing. So let's get started. The 4 key principles as outlined in the article are curiosity, community, learning, and expectations. We will be looking at the principles in detail and going beyond what they mean by exploring the practical possibilities that come with each principle. But before we can even implement the principles into the first day of class content planning, we have a couple things to do prior to the first day of classes. So let me start by giving you some things to think about prior to the first class. If you have absolutely no clue where to start with planning your course, I highly recommend reading the first 2 chapters from Spinnicky and Mikichi's teaching tips. So even if you are already doing these preparations instinctively, it's still a really good reminder. If you haven't thought about these preparation aspects before, it's never too late to start. Before the first day, you should familiarize yourself with the students in your class, the space, and the technology available. You'll probably get a roster of students in each class. Try to look closely to learn as much as you can about the students prior to meeting them. It will give you a sense of what the learning community in each class might look like. For example, in a group class setting, ask yourself these questions. Are they all lower classmen? Are they mostly juniors and seniors? Or are they a combination of both? And why is this important? It's important because it can inform you of the basic levels of their commitment to your class. So for example, a freshman might be excited to be there, super eager to learn, or they might even feel afraid to engage in group activities. Whereas a senior might be already checked out and ready to graduate or have what we call seniority syndrome. This initial scan of your students give you a surface level read on your students and how that would reflect your instructional design. Now, if you're going to be teaching in a classroom, go into the space beforehand and check out the facilities if you haven't taught there before. It can really help calm those first day jitters and nerves down. Is there a projector? How does the computer connect to the big TV screen? Do the speakers work? Like, how does it work? I'm sure we've all encountered faulty technology systems in our days, but what we can do is try to minimize the chance of it happening while we are teaching. In addition to checking the technology, you can even write something on the board and walk to the back of the room to imitate the back of the classroom students to get a sense of the space. Now, since we're in the age of technology and I'm sure most of us are teaching online through Zoom or FaceTime, things like that, it's even more important to test out the programs beforehand. I'm going to use Zoom, for example, because I use that the most. If you've never shared your screen or created breakout rooms or polls on Zoom before, really test those out beforehand. And this will ensure that there will be no time wasted during the class time. So the next point I want to bring up is something we sometimes forget to think about, our wardrobe choices. Whether you're a student teacher or a professor, your students will notice what you're wearing and how you carry yourself. Their first impression of you gives them clues of your personality and even credibility. You also want to think about the level of authority that you want to project in the classroom. If you're like me, I started teaching undergraduates when I was 22, so I was technically only a couple years older than my students. So showing up in a hoodie and jeans just isn't gonna cut it. So I always opted for like a nice blouse, sometimes with a blazer and slacks instead. If you've been teaching for a while, you might not even have to think about this. However, especially now that most of us are teaching online, make sure to check what your students can see on the screen. For example, here I have an overhead camera above the keyboard. So you just want to make sure that you're not wearing shorts or pajama bottoms even when you're working from home. The last thing you should do as preparation for the first day is to consider the rhythm of your speech, the body language you use, and any sort of facial expression or mannerisms you embody. The way you talk to your students should differ from how you talk to your friends and family. And all right, so now that we've done some pre-first day preparations, let's take a look at the active learning component that we'll be incorporating into all of our 4 key principles. So, what is active learning and why is it important? Active learning is the process of involving the learner in the processing of incoming information. It is any learning activity in which the student participates or interacts with the learning process rather than taking in information passively. So if you don't know what I mean, an example of a common teaching format that doesn't involve active learning is a lecture, because students are basically taking in information without doing anything with that information. And when students are given the opportunity to actively engage with the information they're learning, studies have shown that active learning assists with the encoding and elaboration process of the working memory into the long-term memory. So to put it simply, we don't usually store new information in our long-term memory until we do something with that information. And it might be in our short-term memory, but our short-term memory capacity is pretty low and it doesn't last very long. So by implementing active learning in our teaching, we also eliminate the illusion of understanding. So now you are probably looking at this picture of a girl cooking and wondering why you are seeing it. It is the epitome of the illusion of understanding. Just because you've watched cooking shows your whole life doesn't mean you can magically flambe steaks the first time you start cooking. So active learning breaks the cycle of students creating this illusion of understanding. Don't you ever have students who say, well, when you explained this in class, I understood it, but when I had to go home and do it by myself, I had no clue what to do. This happens all the time in every class. Active learning also presents an opportunity for motivation, and it is a lot more interesting than just listening and taking notes or repeating. There are a number of ways you can incorporate active learning into your piano classes, such as peer mentoring, learning pair, and even team-based learning. So I will be talking about them a little more as examples come up in the next slides. Let's now talk about the first key principle, curiosity. James Lang makes a good point that a lot of college courses present students with boxes of content. And in a music school, that might take the form of Music History 1 or keyboard literature from 1700 to 1850, where the professor walks into the first day of class, hands us this box, and expects us to deliver back the information at the end of the semester in a form of a written exam. So lucky for us, the structure of piano classes, whether that's a group setting, a private lesson, or virtual setting, already requires our students to actually play the instrument rather than to sit back and listen to a lecture. However, in all these settings, especially in virtual instruction when everyone is muted most of the times, there is still a tendency of just telling our students what to do in the form of instructions and repetitions. So the first class is a great place to invite your students into an intellectual journey of the music discipline. It's important to establish a sense of purpose for your students. Why are they taking a piano class? What does music mean to them? I usually start the class by telling them about my musical journey and why I decided to pursue music and what music means to me. It's also a perfect opportunity to advocate for the Western classical music to the younger generation. I like to explain that all of our current music originated from traditional Western classical music, that our knowledge in classical music helps us build a new skill with intentional practice that can be applied to so many other areas of our daily lives. And of course, you can say what you believe, but just show them how and why your piano class should matter to them. This past first day of classes, I divided up my students into breakout rooms on Zoom and had them get to know each other a little bit and share their thoughts for a couple of minutes in the beginning of class. I asked them to talk about what they think music is, why we need music in our lives, and what role did music play in their lives in the past and in the present. And I know that what is music is a loaded question, but it's always great to have your students think deeper than what tasks they have to complete to get an A. So, at this point, you might be wondering, But why can't I just introduce myself and hand out the syllabus? So let's talk about it. Why not just hand out the syllabus and go through it and be done with the first day of classes? It's so easy and requires no planning whatsoever. Well, I feel like fundamentally as teachers, we would all like to lead our students on the path to success. Would the syllabus alone be enough to convince them how your class is going to matter in their lives? Would reading the syllabus and telling them to show up and complete assignments mean more to them than just to get a good grade? Starting the class with a list of assignments and what they have to do to get an A encourages extrinsic motivation in your students. And it also conveys the idea that class time is invaluable. Music can be a lifelong appreciation when it's introduced properly. So there are numerous studies and research on how playing an instrument improves your cognitive functions, executive functions, and, in more general terms, it can improve your quality of life. I've had so many students tell me that they used to take piano lessons, but their teachers were either too mean, didn't make music relevant to their lives, or just sucked the interest out of them. And now here they are, years later, in my class, hoping to ignite that interest and keep it going for longer. Going through the grading policy and other rules in the syllabus in detail isn't really going to convince them or spark any curiosity about learning how to play an instrument. Instead, you should use the content that is going to be covered to show them what they can achieve by the end of the semester, to create sort of a guiding path from the very beginning. So there are multiple ways to incorporate this curiosity principle in all types of teaching settings throughout the semester, and not just within the first day of class. I'd like to share my most used method, which is what I call the "but why" principle. It is where you challenge your students' perspectives and vice versa to create a deeper learning environment. It's great for incorporating that active learning component in the classroom. I found that this works especially well in private lessons. When students bring in a piece and performs it with an odd phrasing or interpretation, have them ask themselves, why did they choose to do that? For example, one of my students brought in the prelude to Bach Prelude and Fugue in the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. The ending of the B minor prelude has multiple possibilities, and he played it sort of indecisively. I had him walk me through his thought process of why he chose to do that, and why he didn't play it another way, and why this, and why that. This taps into their critical thinking skills and develops habits of purposeful playing and learning of music rather than just playing what they're told to play or playing what that was given to them. So the same principle works vice versa. The more you ask them why, the more they are inclined to challenge you. And I believe that that is also one of the ways we grow as teachers. I've been using the "but why" principle for years, and shortly after I started, he started questioning my suggestions. And I personally don't take this as rude criticism or disobedience at all. I think a healthy student-teacher relationship should involve questioning each other. And most of the times, I give my explanation to his question, and if it makes sense, then that's that. But sometimes I learn something new that I didn't expect and end up challenging my own thoughts and perspectives. And you might be wondering how you can apply this to a group piano setting since they're just learning the fundamentals. Curiosity can occur in many different ways, like I said. The way I incorporate curiosity into my group classes is through a game, actually. I use this game to dig into their curiosities while assessing their prior knowledge of the subject. The game includes some musical questions that they would eventually learn in the class. Afterwards, I was able to use the content of the syllabus to explain that through these assignments and topics that we will cover, they will be able to answer all these questions and understand them easily by the end of the semester. Okay, So now let's move on to the second key principle, which is community. This might be my favorite principle, if there is such a thing. Learning piano can be such an isolating task. Think about yourself. Like, you go into a lesson, you play for your teacher, and then you go back to the practice room and you're just in there by yourself for hours and hours. Same goes for your group piano students, really. Sure, they're attending class as a group, but the act of practicing is still an individual activity. Think about how good it feels when you're in studio class and get to talk about your struggles and learn that someone else is also going through the same thing. It's so much more comforting, and it encourages you to keep trying and improving. James Lang sums it up pretty well in this quote. "We do not teach brains on sticks. We teach human beings who are inspired by wonder, driven toward community, beset by fears and anxieties, and influenced in countless other ways by aspects of their lives beyond the purely cognitive." I think the word community speaks for itself, that we want to create a nurturing environment for our students to feel comfortable participating in group conversations and feel the support from one another. So how can we, as the teacher, support all our students' emotions to come right on the very first day? So you want to humanize yourself to your students and give your students the opportunity to communicate with one another right from the very first day. Again, but why is this important? Why can't we just conduct the class and not think about creating a community for our students? Like I said previously, learning an instrument is an isolating activity, but it can also be really fun. If we want younger generations to be future advocates for music, and more specifically, classical music, we have to do everything we can to foster that positive connection. Naturally, the further they get into the class, the more busy everyone is and the more overwhelming it can be to navigate learning a new instrument by yourself. Having that community aspect established within the classroom can continue outside the class and aid with students' learning and growth. So, how do we apply this to our classroom? In my years of teaching group piano, I found an effective method that works really well and is easily adaptable to the virtual setting. On the first day, as I mentioned in an example earlier, I put them into groups or breakout rooms on Zoom to discuss the meaning of music and get to know each other in a low-stress environment. After the first day, I implement something I call the piano buddy system. I pair my students and have them exchange contact information, and the piano buddy works in line with the peer tutoring and learning pair method of the active learning component. Okay, in order for you to understand this, let's go on a tangent on peer tutoring for a moment. Peer tutoring or peer learning is essentially students teaching other students. Studies have shown that there is a gain in retention being attributed to deep studying and materials when preparing to teach. Peer tutoring provides mutual support and stimulation, which eventually leads to motivation. Knowing that your partner is depending on you increases the likelihood of you actually doing your work. So it also allows for students to develop their interpersonal and cognitive skills in asking questions, explaining concepts, expressing their opinion, and even admitting to confusion or revealing misconceptions that can be detected very early on. So what I specifically like about the learning pair method is called the learning cell. The learning cell is when both students are assigned the same material and are asked to discuss on questions they have prepared beforehand or when they have been assigned two different materials and are asked to teach it to one another. Now, you might think that this method doesn't necessarily apply to group piano, right? It actually can. Your students might be learning a difficult new piece of 16 measures, for example. Each person could be assigned a different set of 8 measures, and during class time, they can teach each other those 8 measures. You achieve the same goals in a different way. Or you can assign them both the whole 16 measures, and if there are any confusions or misread notes or markings, they can figure out why it is incorrect together using the knowledge they've learned in class. Okay, so now back to the piano buddy. I've used the piano buddy method in both in the in-person classroom setting and now the virtual setting, and it appears to be working quite well. My students respond really, really well to it and are glad to have a chance to connect with their classmates on class content. When teaching virtually, it's important to remember that not all of your students have experience taking online courses and will need extra support from you and their peers. An example of the piano buddy method that I use is when they are reviewing for their juries. There are usually multiple sections, and sometimes it can get overwhelming. So to aid with their learning and retention of materials and details that we cover in class, the week before the jury, I usually give them about 15 minutes at the end of class time to go into the piano buddy pairs and play for each other or review what is necessary. Because the truth is, no matter how great you are of a teacher, there are still going to be some students who prefer to ask their peers questions or ask them in private, and that's totally okay. This is your chance to drop by each group, whether it's from room to room or in person, and give them some TLC in a group class setting. As a side note, I also switched their partners up about 2 to 3 times in a semester, depending on what activities we've done. This gives them a chance to connect with their other peers in the class as well. Other activities I've used with the piano buddy system is having them share their own composition projects or perform for one another or even work together to create a piece to share with the class. There are infinite possibilities to create a community for your students, even when it's virtual. All right, let's now talk about the third key principle, which is learning. And you're thinking, duh, obvious, right? Of course, the students that are in your class are there to learn. But the point of this learning principle is to start right at the very first day of class, as in don't wait until the second class to get them to start learning. Give them a taste of what learning in your class might be like. And this doesn't mean that you have to go crazy with content delivery on the first day. It just means that you can get them to try a cognitive task related to your class before they're ready, maybe, or actively engage them in the learning process somehow right on the very first day. This will give you a sense of their current state of understanding or level of knowledge that you can use to shape your course. This trying before they're ready task can also create more excitement for your students to learn, like being eager to be able to solve a problem or know the answer or learn how to play. James Lang also suggests that you invite your students to think about the course from a metacognitive perspective, which can help them make connections from a previous course. For example, if you're teaching a college group piano class, they are most likely to be undergraduates who are non-music majors and have never taken any music-related class before, let alone learn an instrument. Having them examine the different preparation methods they would need in order to prepare an exam versus a jury, that would be beneficial. There's no more cramming or making study guides and more consistent and mindful practice. These are also key course policies that are generally outlined in the syllabus of a group piano class, but instead of reading it to them, you are having them figure it out and engaging them in the preparations of the class. Okay, now let's move on to the last key principle, expectations. This is where part of your syllabus can be synthesized into the first class. The first 3 principles were more about getting your students engaged in the course right away. This principle is about acknowledging your expectations of your students as well as their expectations of the class and their learning journey. They will, of course, want to know the basics, like what materials they're going to have to buy, what the big projects or assignments will be required to complete. However, I personally tell them outright that I'll cover the nitty-gritty details of the entire syllabus in the second class, because they're here to learn how to play piano. As a result, I give them just the basics of which are my expectations of their attendance, their practice, their participation, and ask them to have respect for each other's learning pace. I also outline basic deadlines of big assignments, but not really the description or details of them, just so they're not overwhelmed with information. And in light of the pandemic, I also feel like it is important to stress the importance of flexibility. You really never know what is going to happen, and things are constantly changing every day. I've already had multiple students miss classes due to being placed in quarantine without pianos, and they have to wait until they recover and come back. It's important to make those contingency plans clear at the beginning of your course. And all that aside, the reality is that not all of your students who show up on the first day will remain enrolled as they're course shopping. And while it's tempting to take it personally, students dropping your class can be a result of so many reasons. There's class conflicts, logistical issues, or they just want to accommodate their priorities, and that's okay. All we can do as the teacher is to sell our course the best we can and engage our students enough on the first day that they want to learn more from you and your discipline. If your course has a printed syllabus, go ahead and hand it to them and ask them to read it through before the next class, instead of reading it all in the first class. So what I found very effective in the first day of class in establishing expectations for both you and your students is having an open discussion or doing some sort of short brainstorming session during class. I like to ask my students this overarching question: what steps do you, your teacher, and your peers need to take to succeed in this class? More specifically, what do you expect from yourself? What do you expect from your peers? And what do you expect from me as your teacher? If this was an in-person classroom setting, I would usually have them write out their answers in the board, in those categories on the board. But this semester, I used Poll Everywhere to get them to engage and give their thoughts and input virtually. So for those who don't know what Poll Everywhere is, you can basically get people to answer surveys right from their phone. So that's what I used. And the answers will appear on the screen that I share. It's very cool. It is very effective to have a discussion with your students afterwards as well to solidify those expectations and to hold each other accountable in the classroom throughout the semester. And again, the act of engaging your students in an activity to think about the content of your class or to actively learn something is always going to be more effective than simply telling it to them. It works just as well in the private lesson setting. I find that it is always helpful to create goals and expectations for the semester and revisit them throughout the semester to see if we're still going in the right path. Okay, now that we have gone through all the key principles, what happens after the first day? I sort of already hinted at it. Make sure there is a follow-up after day one. Think about the first day of the class as the starting point of this maze, and the use of a learning management system in the next class and beyond as a pathway that guides you and your students to the very last day of the semester. An easy learning management system is whatever your institution uses, and most popularly are like Canvas and Blackboard. However, there are multiple other platforms that you can use as learning management system if you are teaching independently. It helps you organize and record what has been done in the class and plan the path for the course. And you can record all the first day activities and findings on this learning management system. And as your course progresses, find ways to link your opening day activities to the current course content you're teaching. So, for example, In the first day of my group piano classes this semester, we talked about efficient ways to practice as opposed to cramming. Throughout the semester, I remind them of those practice methods we brainstormed earlier in the course and how it can be applied to our current repertoire practicing regimen. So when we get to the last day of the semester, it's always really, really exciting to see your students' reactions when you point back to where they started. In the beginning, in the beginner's group piano class, I point back to when they knew nothing, absolutely nothing about note reading, no knowledge about classical music whatsoever, or even how to listen to them, and see how far they've come. When planning for a first day of classes, always think about how you can connect what you do to the very last day of the class, and vice versa. Giving students a quick recap of their musical journey or having them do a quick reflection on their journey is completely recommended, as that gives your students a sense of accomplishment and encourages them to keep continuing on this path. And by all means, I am not telling you that you have to incorporate all 4 key principles into your first day of classes. It is simply something to think about, and if they're well thought out, some activities might even hit multiple principles while also incorporating the active learning component. So if you are a student teacher or still new to teaching, it might be helpful to break down the components of your first class planning to see how much time you are spending on each activity to make sure that it is equally balanced. So here's a breakdown of from my previous example where I spent 20 minutes on introductions, 20 minutes on engaging my students in learning activities, and 10 minutes for some wrap up on the learning management system and assignments for the next class. Teaching online can be challenging. I know, and I'm sure all of you do know too, but it really doesn't have to be if it is planned right. Like James Lang said, online courses can easily become bloodless transactions of brains behind screens. And there are so many more tips and advice I have for teaching online effectively, but that's a topic for another time. So if you are still unsure of how effective your first day of classes went, really don't worry at all. Just go ahead and send your students a quick survey of some things you want to find out. Here are examples of questions that I sent to my students. I personally used Google Forms because it's super easy to navigate and you can easily make the submissions anonymous. Some statistics confirmed my thoughts already, and some comments gave me more ideas of how to make adjustments as the class progresses throughout the semester to better serve my students' needs. You can ask them about their overall experience of the first day of class, how they felt about the syllabus not being covered in detail on the very first day, or whether they felt like class went as they expected. From giving my students short surveys, it allowed me to easily get feedback directly from them and adjust my class planning and structure. And some might have wanted more games, some might have wanted to play out loud more, some wanted more breakout rooms. Students don't usually tell you things like that until the very end of the semester evaluation. So it is 100% guaranteed that by giving out surveys early on in the class can give you a whole lot of valuable information. So I'm sure that at this point you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, this is so much information. Where do I even start? Okay, you keep doing what you're doing, but whatever you do on the first day of class, make sure you're thinking more about just getting through the day, because I know how easy it is to do that when you're anxious or nervous about it. It might seem like you have to invest a lot more time into planning, but I hope that I have convinced you today that it is very, very much worth it. And once you've done it, you can just keep tweaking it in the future. And it gets easier as it becomes part of your teaching habit and teaching routine. And creating an effective first day of class can have a lasting impact on your students, whether you see it right away at the beginning or not. Start the semester with enthusiasm and digging into your students' curiosities and creating an engaging learning environment for your class. I promise that you'll have a lot more happy faces in your classroom and or screen. So if you have listened all the way through, thank you so much for listening to me talk for this long. I hope I have given you some valuable key principles to think about and incorporate into your music classes. If you are interested in learning more about how to make the most out of the first day of classes, there are plenty of literature out there on how to cope with first day teaching anxieties and effective strategies in specific lesson planning. I am also always learning new ways to incorporate these principles and active learning into different teaching settings. So if you have other ideas and would like to discuss them, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me at nichastap@gmail.com or through any of these social media platforms. I want to thank the Indiana Music Teachers Association again for giving me and so many other educators an opportunity to share our ideas and learn from each other virtually during this time. I hope you all continue to stay safe, and I hope to meet you all in person someday soon. Thank you so much. Bye.